Hazor was not just a city, it was a giant among the Canaanites. Situated in the north, in a strategic region, its fame spread like wildfire through dry straw. Whoever dominated Hazor dominated trade, routes, and war. And in this setting, under the imposing walls and between the stone corridors of the fortified city, Jabin grew up. His name would become synonymous with power, fear, and resistance against the Israelites. From an early age, he learned what it meant to carry the crown of Hazor. The old warriors told him about the ancestors who built the city and turned it into the impregnable fortress that it was. Hazor will never fall, the advisors said, and Jabin heard this as a promise, or perhaps a warning. Under his leadership, the city prospered. Its armies were numerous, its horses swift, and its iron chariots feared by all. No other Canaanite city was as strong as his. He wasn't just a king. He was the lord of the northern lands, the one to whom other lesser kings submitted. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But something was changing. Messengers were arriving with disturbing reports. The Israelites, led by a man called Joshua, had crossed the Jordan like an unexpected storm. They had defeated Jericho, swept through Ai, and were now advancing through the territory of Canaan as if nothing could stop them. Jabin watched from afar, assessing the movements of these foreigners. They hadn't reached the north yet, but it was only a matter of time. He knew that fighting alone was madness. If the Israelites had won fortified cities, they could not be underestimated. Jabin therefore decided to act before it was too late. He called messengers, sent out invitations, and raised the largest army Canaan had ever seen. If war was inevitable, he would make it a show of strength. Hazor was more than just a powerful kingdom. It was the jewel of the north, the city that loomed over the others like a predator watching its prey. Its walls were immense, made to withstand time and war. Within them, the sound of iron chariot wheels echoed through the cobbled streets, mingling with the noise of commerce that pulsed around every corner. Merchants brought spices, fabrics, and precious metals, while warriors trained under the watchful eye of their commanders. Everything in Hazor was grand, calculated, as if the ground itself carried the weight of its history. Jabin grew up hearing that his city was untouchable. No matter how many tribes rose up around it, Hazor always prevailed. The other Canaanite kings were nothing more than pieces on a board that he moved at will. Some owed him tribute, others feared his power. With each passing year, the army grew, the storehouses filled up, and the city became stronger. His reign was not just over Hazor, but over a vast network of allies and subordinates. When Jabin spoke, the kings listened, and when he threatened, everyone trembled. But now, a different threat loomed. The Israelites were not like the neighboring kingdoms that Hazor could subdue with gold or the force of the sword. They had no walls, no chariots of war, but they marched across the land as if the land itself belonged to them. They had defeated armies larger than their own and taken cities that until then had seemed impregnable. And what's worse, they did this with the confidence of those who do not fear gods or men, but only follow the voice of something invisible and implacable. Jabin felt that his untouchable city's time was running out. If Hazor wanted to remain the crown of the north, it had to prove that it was unbreakable. War was coming, and he knew he couldn't fight it alone. Jabin was no fool. He saw the fate of the other kings and understood that alone he would not survive. The Israelites were advancing like a storm, tearing down walls, burning cities, defeating armies that seemed unbeatable. Each battle won by Joshua was like a thunderclap, announcing that the Canaanites' time was running out. But Hazor was different. Hazor was the heart of the north, and its king would not let it fall without a fight. The decision was made quickly. Messengers were sent galloping in all directions, carrying a call that could not be ignored. The war was no longer just about Hazor, but about the whole of Canaan. Kings of Madon, Shimron, Akshaph, and other cities were ordered to gather their armies. Warriors came from the mountains, the plains, and the lowlands, carrying shields, spears, and swords. The sound of blacksmiths hammering weapons filled the days and nights. Horses were groomed, iron chariots lined up, ready to cut through the battlefield like sharp blades. When all the armies finally came together, Jabin contemplated his work. Never before had so many warriors gathered under a single command in Canaan. Armed men covered the fields like a swarm. The chariots of war shone in the sun, imposing, heavy and deadly. He had in his hands the greatest military alliance the North had ever seen. If Joshua thought he could destroy Hazor as he had Jericho and Ai, he was mistaken. This time, the Israelites would not face a lone enemy. This time, they would face a wall of men and iron. The wind blew, carrying dust and the smell of freshly worked leather armor. The banners fluttered, displaying the symbols of the allied cities. Jabin mounted his horse and looked at his army. The moment had come. The war that would define the future of Canaan was about to begin. The sun was rising golden over the horizon when Jabin saw his army ready for battle. The earth shook under the weight of horses and iron chariots. Endless ranks of warriors lined up, shields raised, spears pointed skywards. The air was filled with dust and expectation. The king of Hazor was certain of one thing. Never in the history of Canaan had such a large force gathered in one place. It was impossible to lose. It was impossible for a handful of nomads to resist this avalanche of power. But the Israelites didn't fight like other armies. They weren't just warriors. They were men driven by a conviction that went beyond the logic of war. They didn't fear iron chariots or crowds of soldiers. Their eyes did not see the greatness of Jabin's strength, but only the promise of victory that their God had given them. And so, without hesitation, they marched out to meet the enemy. The battle didn't begin with spears or swords, but with something unexpected. Suddenly the clouds closed over the field, and the sky, which until then had shone clear, became a dark pall. The cutting wind swept across the plain, bringing with it the roar of thunder. Then the storm broke. The rain fell with uncontrollable fury, turning the ground into mud, sinking wheels, overturning horses, rendering useless the war chariots that were the pride of the Canaanite army. The warriors tried to reorganize themselves, but the Israelites were already upon them, advancing like a river bursting a dam. Jabin saw the impossible happening before his eyes. His advantage was disappearing. His allies fell one by one. The battle that was supposed to seal the Israelites' defeat was turning against him. And now, what had seemed like an absolute triumph was turning into a desperate struggle for survival. The battlefield, once solid and firm under the hooves of the horses, had now become a treacherous swamp. The iron chariots, Jabin's great advantage, were stuck in the mud like cornered beasts. The Canaanite warriors tried to pull them out, cries of despair mingling with the roar of the storm, but it was no use. The ground had turned against them, and while they struggled to move, the Israelites were already upon them, swift as wolves on the hunt. Spears pierced armor, swords cut through the heavy mist of the rain, and Jabin's army, which had begun that battle as an unstoppable force, was now tearing itself to pieces. Men ran in all directions, trying to find refuge, but there was nowhere to run. Joshua and his army attacked with surgical precision, guided by a fury that seemed to come not just from them, but from something much greater. It was as if the land itself had risen up against the Canaanites. Jabin watched helplessly from his horse. What was supposed to be a massacre against the Israelites had turned into a nightmare for his own people. The allied kings fell one by one, their banners falling into the mud, crushed under the feet of the victors. Their warriors, so trained and disciplined, now became easy prey for an army that fought as if each blow were the fulfillment of an inevitable destiny. There was no way to turn the battle around. The only thing left for Jabin was to flee. If he stayed, he would be just one more body among many. Pulling hard on the reins, he turned his horse and shot across the soggy plain, the rain cutting his face like invisible blades. He needed to get back to Hazor. He needed to understand how it had all happened. And above all, he needed to save what was left of his kingdom before the Israelites took it all. Jabin rode like a man running from his own shadow. The rain dripped down his face, mixed with the cold sweat of fear. His eyes scanned the landscape looking for survivors, some sign that his army was still holding out. But all he saw were bodies scattered in the mud, torn banners, and the distant echoes of screams that died away in the roar of the storm. He pressed his lips together, forcing himself not to look back. He couldn't. Hazor's fate now depended on his escape. When he finally caught sight of the city gates, his heart raced. Hazor was still standing, its walls intact, its towers rising against the cloudy sky. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. He knew the Israelites wouldn't stop. What they had done on the battlefield was only the beginning. They would come, and when they arrived, they wouldn't just find a fortified city, they would find a king who refused to go down without a fight. The gates opened before him, and Jabin galloped in, soaking wet, covered in mud and shame. The eyes of the soldiers and servants who still remained in Hazor were full of questions that no one dared to ask. They wanted to know where the army was that had set out full of glory. They wanted to understand how the king of the Canaanites returned alone, defeated, while the drums of war still echoed in the distance. But no one asked. They knew the answer would come soon. Jabin dismounted with difficulty, his legs trembling. He needed to think. He needed to act. The city was still strong. It would still resist. But something inside him told him that time was against him. The Israelites were relentless. They were like a tide advancing relentlessly, and now it was coming towards Hazor. He turned to one of his generals, his voice harsh and urgent. "Get ready, they're coming." The city was restless. The silence in the streets was not one of peace, but of fear. Servants ran to and fro, reinforcing doors, closing windows, bringing supplies inside the walls. The warriors who had stayed in Hazor were sharpening swords, checking armor, and preparing arrows. Everyone knew what was coming. Jabin walked through the palace, each step echoing off the stone walls. He needed a plan. Hazor was a fortress, the largest in Canaan. No city had stood as long as it had, but something inside him knew that this time was different. The Israelites were not like other enemies. They didn't conquer cities to rule them. They destroyed them. They didn't accept tribute. They didn't negotiate treaties. They weren't bought by gold or promises. What they wanted was the land, and nothing less would make them back down. Outside, the scouts returned with bad news. The Israelites were marching towards Hazor, fast, relentless. It was as if the very storm of battle was still pushing them forward. And they were not alone. The news that reached the king's ears was worse than he imagined. It wasn't just a small group of warriors. It wasn't an army tired from the last fight. Joshua and his men were in one piece, ready to wipe out what was left of the Canaanite resistance. Jabin clenched his fist on the stone parapet, looking beyond the walls. The city, which had always been a symbol of power and security, now looked like a cage. If they didn't resist, there would be nowhere else to run. There would be no tomorrow for Hazor. But if he knew his city, he knew it wouldn't fall easily. And if it was to fall, it would fall fighting. The sound of a war horn cut through the air. They were coming. The sound of the war horn echoed through Hazor like thunder, carrying an unmistakable warning. The Israelites were at the door. Jabin quickly climbed to the highest tower and, from there, watched the dust rise on the horizon. A sea of warriors was advancing, disciplined, organized, without hesitation. The banners of Israel fluttered in the wind, and in front of them stood Joshua, his gaze fixed on the city, determined as if he already knew the outcome of the battle. Hazor's guards were positioned on the walls, archers with arrows aimed, ready for the first sign of attack. The gates were locked, reinforced with everything they had. The streets were empty, the civilians hiding inside their houses, fearing what would happen next. But everyone knew that there was no safe hiding place if the Israelis broke through the gates. Jabin took a deep breath. He had seen kingdoms fall before these men. He knew that this was no ordinary war. There was something bigger there, something he didn't understand. It was as if the Israelites' every step was guided by an invisible force, as if the land itself wanted to hand them victory. But Hazor would not fall without resistance. The first attack came like a wave, crashing against a rock. Arrows cut through the air, spears were thrown from the top of the walls, and for a moment it looked as if the city would resist. But Joshua didn't attack like the other kings. He didn't retreat. He didn't hesitate. His men were tireless, surging against the walls, surrounding Hazor on all sides. The defenders began to give way, one by one. Jabin felt the weight of the inevitable. The city was surrounded, and the Israelites were not going to leave. They were there to finish what they had started. The battle for Hazor intensified. Fire spread through the wooden houses inside the city, turning night into day with its orange light. The smell of smoke and blood hung in the air, mingling with the cries of men fighting until their last breath. On the walls, the defenders still held out, but their numbers were dwindling fast. The Israelites attacked with the fury of someone who didn't know the meaning of defeat. They didn't tire, they didn't retreat. It was as if they knew that victory already belonged to them. Jabin was still there, his sword dirty with dust and sweat, his chest rising and falling in heavy breathing. The king of Hazor would not run away this time. There was nowhere else to go. He looked around and saw his city, the great Hazor, burning. The streets that had once been full of life were now covered in ash and corpses. His warriors, those who had sworn to defend him, were falling one by one. What had once seemed like an unshakable fortress was now nothing more than a tomb, waiting to be sealed. The gates finally gave way with a deafening crash. The reinforced wood couldn't withstand the Israelites' advance, and the tide of warriors swept over Hazor like a river breaking through a dike. The fighting in the streets was brutal and short. The Israelites were fast, precise, and ruthless. They weren't there to conquer, they were there to exterminate. Jabin felt the weight of fate on his shoulders. He gripped his sword tightly, knowing he wouldn't make it out alive. But if Hazor fell, he would fall with honor. He positioned himself in the middle of the palace courtyard, waiting for the inevitable moment. The sound of enemy boots echoed through the corridors. They were coming, and so the king of Hazor prepared to face his last moments. The sound of steel against steel echoed through the palace corridors as the last of Jabin's men tried to resist. But it was useless. The Israelites were like death itself, advancing without haste, without mercy. The king of Hazor stood in the center of the courtyard, his fists clenching the hilt of his sword until his knuckles were white. His body ached, his heart hammered in his chest, but he would not kneel. He wouldn't beg for his life. The first enemy came running towards him, sword raised. Jabin dodged, spinning around with a sharp blow. But before he could regain his balance, another Israelite appeared from the side, cutting through his defense. He staggered, feeling the warmth of the blood running down his arm. Still, he stood firm. Two more advanced. The king fought like a cornered beast, but the reality was inescapable. He was alone, and his kingdom no longer existed. Then he felt the final blow. A blade tore through his chest, robbing him of air. Jabin fell to his knees, the sword slipping from his fingers. The world around him spun, the flames reflecting in his sweat and pain-stained eyes. As his vision began to darken, he realized that Hazor, the city that should never fall, was now burning to the ground. The body of the king of Hazor fell to the cold stones of the courtyard, and with it fell the last remnant of Canaanite power in the north. Joshua and his men left no survivors. The city was reduced to ashes, a reminder to anyone who dared defy the God of Israel. Hazor's flames faded with time, but its ruin remained like a whisper in the wind. a dark echo of the greatness it had once been. The name of Jabin, once pronounced with respect and awe, became only a distant memory, a warning to those who defied forces greater than they could comprehend. The story of the king of Hazor is not just a tale of war and destruction. It is a portrait of how pride can blind even the most powerful. Jabin trusted in his armies, his walls, his alliances. He believed that the iron of his chariots and the grandeur of his city would be enough to keep him on the throne. But he didn't realize that his real defeat didn't begin when the Israelites surrounded his gates. It began much earlier, when he ignored the signs that something much bigger than him was on the move. Jabin's mistake was the same as that of many kings before and after him, thinking he was invincible. He saw the Israelites overthrow cities, win impossible battles, walk as if they already knew the end of the story. But instead of trying to understand what drove them, he treated them as just another enemy to be crushed. And that was his end. Perhaps the greatest lesson that Jabin leaves us is not in his death or the fall of Hazor, but in the way he chose to face fate. He had chances to change, to seek another path, but he clung to his own strength until there was nothing left to hold on to. And so the story of the king of Hazor is lost in the dust of time, a silent warning to all those who believe that power and security can last forever. For in the end, what really remains are not the walls we build, but the paths we choose to follow. If you liked Jabim's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.